Hello, comrades and compatriots. My name is TB Skyn, and League of Legends has just received a substantial update to the Void. That is the unspecified, rather vaguely defined hell dimension that lurks on the outskirts of space and drives people mad and occasionally regurgitates monsters into the League of Legends universe, where they wreak all kinds of havoc and do sort of generic evil things. Now, the Void has been a presence in the League of Legends universe for quite a long time, but it has never really been substantially explored as an entity. They haven't really done a lot of exploration of what it does to the world of Runeterra, or how it affects the creatures there. It's just sort of, it's this sort of vaguely Lovecraftian horror dimension from whence they can draw sort of malevolent alien creatures that they can use as champions. That was the role of the Void for a long time. But with this update, they've released a bunch of fantastic concept art for it, a bunch of stories for champions like Kassadin, Malzahar, and for Kai'Sa, indeed. Sort of explaining a little bit more how they came to be part of the Void, what the Void means for their characters and everything that's going on. So today, we're going to be taking a look at what I think is actually the most substantial update to the Void, and that is the aesthetic update. Because if we take a look at the traditional Void champions, the first thing you'll notice with the Void champions is that they're kind of all over the place. In a lot of ways, there really isn't a super unifying aesthetic that's kind of tying them all together, except that they all tend to be some description of purple, except of course for Kog'Maw, who tends to be more identified with the color green. It's a little bit of a mishmash and a mess, and it's something that speaks to the roots of the Void as just being, oh, it's the evil space dimension thing from that we pull alien champions from, where it started, and now they're trying to sort of unify it into something that is more coherent. The champion that probably best reflects the current visual state of the Void is a champion like Vel'Koz. He has a visual design, along perhaps with Rek'Sai, that somewhat reflects the way that the Void wants to be perceived now. And if you want to look at someone who doesn't really reflect what the Void is supposed to look like nowadays, you might look at someone like Kog'Maw or someone like Cho'Gath, who don't really fit into the aesthetic anymore. But what is that aesthetic, and where does it come from, and does it have a recognizable history, and why does it look the way that it does? Because there are some rather interesting reasons. The thing about malevolent space dimensions and evil aliens is that if you want to talk about pop cultural depictions of evil aliens, there really isn't any way to have that conversation without also talking about this. The Alien, designed by H.R. Giger for the original Alien film way back in the 1970s. This is a seminal piece of sci-fi visual design, and the entire aesthetic that Giger represents with his work is tremendously influential in the ways in which we depict the unknowable, horrifying biological alien nowadays. Not necessarily the mechanical alien, but Giger's style is very much marked, as indeed you can see in this depiction of the alien costume, by a fusion of the organic, but also the metallic, the robotic, the inorganic. We have this alien which looks like it's put together from tubes and you know, rubber equipment and hosing, and that's very much part of the style. They wanted something for the film where the alien wasn't, you know, some version of a giant praying mantis or something recognizable from the Earth. So they went to Giger, who has a very long history of designing deeply surreal, deeply uncomfortable, very alienating, literally alienating, and unpleasant designs that just reject human warmth and sympathy. Also, his designs tended to be extremely sexual. I actually had some trouble finding designs that I was comfortable showing in this video because I don't want to demonetize, because there's penises in a lot of them, and there's like vaginas in a lot of them, depicted in a very mechanical, dehumanized, flesh and machine intertwined kind of way that's deeply unpleasant. But the reason we have to talk about H.R. Giger is because the aliens and their depiction has been monumentally influential in the ways that we depict hostile alien sci-fi universes, along with many other influences. Of course, the history of sci-fi is long and complicated, but when I look at the Void as it is being defined by Riot in this update, that is aesthetically one of the first places I go to. And one of the clearest ways of showing you this, take a look at this void creature striding across some kind of landscape. I want you to notice one specific feature. Notice all the lines it's composed of. All those lines that kind of stream out and form these fan-like structures all across it, and all the twisting of, you know, geometry that goes into creating it. The same thing is apparent if you look at these void tendrils sucking up into the world. So much, almost mushroom-like in some ways, but you can see that constantly recurring motif of lines next to each other, crossing over the figure. And this is something you can pretty much see in all the void designs. It's pretty obvious here, and it's very obvious in this design. Now I want you to take a look at this. Look at the way this ceiling is made. Look at the way he uses that same idea of these constantly repeating shapes and patterns, which appears a lot when he does tubing, and you can see it happens here, and it happens in this twist here. It is especially obvious. And all across H.R. Giger's art, that kind of aesthetic is present. And it's used because it is alienating, because when the human mind beholds something like this, we are put in mind of bones, of internal organs, of fungus, of all kinds of things that are not really welcoming to humans, that are not really pleasant to us, that are not really nice to us. It's alienating. It's something that repels us on a relatively fundamental scale. Like, this does not look like something I want to touch. I don't want to, well, I do want to touch it because I'm a weirdo, but generally speaking, when you look at something like that, if you saw that, that's not like, oh, that's very pleasant, I want to spend time there. That's, oh my holy fucking shit, that's a nightmare from which I hope I can awake as quickly as possible, because it's horrifying. And much of H.R. Giger's art is. And the most obvious influence, really, of Giger on the void aesthetic comes from that motif, that repetition of lines to create this deeply unnatural, unsettling shape language that makes the thing look both biological but also not quite real, not quite normal. Another thing they do, something they also borrow somewhat, not so much from H.R. Giger, but as you can see here, Giger was very fond of twisting shapes into ways that they weren't supposed to be able to behave. Now, Giger was also very fond of bulging, very rounded, very curved shapes in a lot of his designs. This indeed comes across in the Alien. In the original concept art for the Alien, this part of the back of its head had a little ridge on it that made it look unmistakably like, well, male genitalia, even more than it already does. But Giger is very fond of this kind of juxtaposing this harsh, sharp ugliness with this very curved, flat smoothness, this featureless smoothness as a contrast to, you know, the extreme busyness of everything else that he creates. And this is something that is not quite stolen here. Here, they have chosen to go with a much more geometric shape design style. You can see void creatures in League of Legends tend to be much more pointy, and the void aesthetic tends to be much more pointy. There's lots of jagged lines, lots of edges going on, which is something that Giger did not traffic in so much. But this is also something that has kind of arisen out of the same idea of twisting shapes in ways that they shouldn't be. Like this, for instance, this is clearly a creature, right? This is some kind of living creature that these poor soldiers are attempting to attack. But look what happens to its left side over here. That is not something that living shapes are supposed to do. So it exists in this weird crossroad between being a set of geometric shapes and being an alive thing. And this is something that's also very obvious with this, whatever the hell it is, that it is this mishmash. It's mashing up something which is fundamentally unbiological, which is harsh geometric shapes that living creatures don't often have, at least not complex, especially not mammalian creatures tend to have. Something that maybe you'll see with an insect, maybe you'll see it with certain kinds of slugs or fungus, but this is not cuddly. There's no cuteness, there's no warmth, and no biological appeal to it. It is a creature composed of shapes and lines that shouldn't exist on a living thing. And that is something that's evolved from Giger's, use of this stuff in sci-fi imagery, where he was very fond of twisting shapes in unnatural ways that they weren't supposed to go. And they've taken the same sort of idea and put a slight spin on it. Now, this is something I've seen before. Magic the Gathering, I think, has a few pieces of artwork that mimics the same kind of style when it comes to horrifying void creatures of various kinds. And in other artwork, for instance, if you think of something like the Zerg from StarCraft, they are also inspired heavily by Giger, obviously. If you look at a Hydralisk, that is just an alien with a few of the bits switched out and some colors changed. But they also tended in StarCraft to go for a style that combined these harsher geometric shapes. Like in StarCraft Zerg, you'll see a lot of these kinds of curves in their creatures as well, usually to form spines or spikes or all kinds of other unpleasant geometry on a creature that's not really supposed to be there. But this is something that has bled into a lot of the horrors of the cosmic void kind of visual design. And that's really the thing that all of this is. Also, spirals. The League of Legends artists, when defining what the void is, are very fond of spiral imagery. As you can see here, for example, you can see how Kassadin, as he floats over this landscape, this hole deeper into the void, and every time there's a way to progress somewhere, it tends to be ringed by these undulating, curving shapes, almost like spine, but almost also kind of like seaweed, like you're descending into the ocean in a sense. Like this looks like the kind of thing that a plant deep under the sea might grow, or an anemone, or some kind of coral might grow in a shape that looked somewhat like this. But spirals are a popular theme, as indeed you can see here. Like this thing is made of spirals. There's a spiral here, there's a spiral there, spirals here, spirals, almost half-completed spirals around the legs. Like everything sort of curves in on itself, which also reminds me in some ways of something like a black hole, which we tend to imagine in our popular consciousness as this cosmic drain with material kind of circling into oblivion, being sucked into it. Of course, dark holes don't actually suck things into them. That's not quite how gravity works, but the spiral motif is very much present here. And you can see it here. This is supposed to be dead void tissue. Like it's void tissue that has run out of things to feast on and can't really spread or be alive anymore. So it's kind of ragged and all broken, but you can see it keeps attempting to form these very curved shapes, almost spiral-like shapes. And the same thing goes here. You can see above this horrifying creature, almost like a halo, another subtle spiraling shape. Everything in the void seems to spiral around itself, to spiral in on itself, to drag you, like the drain in a bathtub, into itself. And that ties into the way that they have defined the void in the new lore, is that it is something that consumes. Like its only goal is to consume everything. That's the only thing it wants. It wants to consume magic, and it wants to consume biological flesh, or just biological material. That's what the void wants, in the sense that this nameless cosmic horror can want anything. It just wants to absorb, consume, drain things out of the world. That is its function. That is its desire. As a kind of cosmic decay. The void, almost in, like a lot of other, horrifying cosmic entities, indeed Lovecraftian, Elder Gods kind of horror tends to deal in the same kind of nihilistic approach, where the cold and ceaseless universe only wants to consume you. It doesn't care about anything else. It doesn't have desire or morality or any, personality, indeed, or anything recognizably human about it. It just has a driving need to consume, which I think is interesting. Something that's also interesting, especially in this picture, is they're toying a little bit with Mobius strip designs. Now, if you don't know what a Mobius strip is, a Mobius strip is a shape with only one side, which sounds weird, but you can actually make it just out of a little strip of paper. You can YouTube your way to that, but essentially it's a shape. It's kind of like those impossible shapes, the triangle where all the sides don't seem to meet properly, which is the heck is his name? The surrealist who does the stairs that lead into themselves. Can't remember his name right now. I'm sure I'll remember the moment I'm done recording this video. But shapes that fold in on themselves, shapes that look impossible, that look like it shouldn't be possible for them to exist, which is something that's also present here. Like this really shouldn't be possible. This shouldn't really hold together. Like, where's the connecting tissue? How does it move? How does it work? It just does. Because it doesn't really obey laws of physics as we understand them. And by the way, why do we even identify this as a creature, as some kind of lumbering titan? Well, because it has legs, because it has arms, and because up here, with all the light pouring out, we tend, as humans, to attempt to identify something like eyes. And that's a clever little manipulation of the way that humans tend to see things, because we are hardwired, we are programmed on a biological level to look for faces. So this is why smiley faces work. This is why you can put 2 dots and a line on a piece of paper, and the human brain will go, oh, that's a face, even though demonstrably, no, it's not. And that's why I can look at this thing and say, that looks kind of like it's a creature, it's a living thing, because we are just programmed to look for life forms and for living things that are identifiably biological. Yeah, that's really the core of what the Void is. It's an H.R. Giger and sort of cosmic horror, Lovecraftian-inspired mess of things that should be logically impossible, but which are strung together in such a way to imply a physical creature. Now, this, of course, leaves League of Legends with a little bit of a problem, because all this concept art we've been looking at, all of this stuff is very cool, and the creature designs we've got going on here, these are very cool as well. But none of these guys really look like them. Vel'Koz does, a little bit. He's got a little bit of that thing going on. Indeed, you can see here, he's got the tentacles in particular that help inspire, that can be used to create those spiral shapes. And he's got that sort of alien-inspired spiny carapace thing going on with the lines across that we discussed. Like, he's the one who's closest, I think, as it stands, to the ways in which the League of Legends wants to represent the Void. But someone like Kha'Zix, indeed someone like Kai'Sa, or Kassadin, or Cho'Gath, or Kog'Maw, Malzahar, or even Rek'Sai, they're not really this. This is not really what they look like. They look like something that could come, theoretically, from a similar design aesthetic, but if this is what a Voidborn looks like, and indeed that is what the concept art says, then these guys really don't look that much like it, I don't think. So that's something that I'm curious to see how much League of Legends is going to update their champions on a visual basis to fit these pieces of concept art, because what we saw with Targon is that so far they haven't really bothered to update their existing Targonian champions to really fit in with the aesthetics that they define for these regions in the lore. And eventually I feel like that's going to become an aesthetic problem for League of Legends, in the sense that a lot of its underlying concept art and its underlying visual concepts are going to become increasingly divorced from the actual visual state of the game, and that's... Eventually, you're gonna have some artists who don't know how to work together anymore because they're working from very different design specs. But I don't really know how that's organized on the back end. Like, this concept art is probably just that. It's like vague conceptual explorations of what could Void creatures look like. And then when it comes time to design a champion, is like, yeah, but from a game design perspective, we can't really have a shapeless void of spirals just kind of ambling around the rift. We need something that looks like a creature, so our animators can animate it, and so that we can make it emote and have people sympathize and empathize with it, and see it as a character rather than a shapeless, you know, nameless husk of a thing. This is, by the way, when you think of the original Alien movie, one of the things that made the alien so terrifying is that there was no human way to understand it. You couldn't really think of it in terms of an animal. You couldn't really think of it in terms of anything knowable. It was just this awful thing from space that wants you dead, and no one can hear you scream. That was kind of the underlying concept, and indeed, much of the concept behind H.R. Giger's art. He doesn't want to be approachable in any of the work that he does. He doesn't want to be comfortable. He doesn't want to welcome you. He just wants to shock you and see you suffer for it. And that kind of doesn't work. Like, this is always the trouble with when you're designing characters, when you're designing champions, when you're designing stuff. Like, because even Cho'Gath, who's... and Kog'Maw, who are not really, massive personalities, still have distinct personalities in the sense that they have something that you could call a character. They aren't just insensate geometric shapes that hunger but don't really care to communicate about it. They do care to communicate about it. They communicate a lot, in fact. They have emotions, they have anger, they have, they have dance emotes, all that stuff that's needed to make a champion. I will say, though, if they ever do make a champion, like, who's really this, who's really that kind of deeply alienating, doesn't care if you like it, doesn't care about anything except to perform its function, kind of living geometrical objects in space that don't make any sense, that would be interesting. That, from a design perspective, that would be bold. It would also be fucking difficult. I won't blame them if they don't, because that's a really hard thing to try and take on, and it's not really how League of Legends champions traditionally are designed. But that's something I would be excited to see if they ever let the people who do the concept art get a crack at designing what the champions are going to look like. That I would be excited for that. Overall, I very much like the visual definition they've gotten for the Void, because of course I do. Like, Riot has great artists. They have fantastic artists who do amazing work, and I'm mostly just annoyed that we don't get to see more of it. So everything about this is very cool. My concern is how much of all of this cool stuff is actually going to be integrated into any of this stuff. So, if you have any comments, feel free to leave them down below. If you have any questions, anything you'd like me to talk about related to the Void or to League of Legends aesthetic or game aesthetics or other kinds of aesthetics in general, I'm very happy to talk about it. You can leave that down in the comments down below. There's a like button if you are so inclined. There's a dislike button if you feel like this has been a tremendous waste of your time. But if you do, I'd be surprised if you made it this far. You can subscribe too. That's, that's the thing you can do. My name has been CB's Guy, and thank you very much for watching. Blah, 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 blah.